What would you do if the only person who ever believed in you left you nothing but a set of old tools and a secret that had been waiting 60 years to be found? We have been telling stories at Cabin Stories for a long time now, and we have learned something true about the people who find us here. You are not the kind of person who gives up easily. So stay close because this one is for you. Rosalind Wick, no, wait. We need to go back further than that. We need to go back to the woman herself, before we get to the cabin, before the ice, before the thing she pulled out of the frozen ground that changed everything. Sable Voss was 22 years old when she arrived in the town of Harrow's Crossing with $43 in her coat pocket, a cracked leather satchel, and the weight of a grief so fresh it still had sharp edges. She had driven herself up from the south in a borrowed truck that coughed and complained the whole 600 kilometers through the flat October farmland, and then up into the shield country, where the trees closed in, and the lake started appearing between the rock faces like still gray eyes. She had never been this far north. She had never had any reason to come. The reason now was a name on a deed. Adeline Fournier, her great-aunt, had died in September and left Sable the only thing she owned. A cabin on the edge of Loon Lake, outside of Harrow's Crossing, Ontario. Sable had met Adeline exactly 4 times in her life. Her mother had kept them apart, for reasons that were never explained and that Sable had long since stopped asking about. When the letter came from the lawyer, her mother had said, without looking up from the kitchen table, "Take it or leave it, but don't expect help from me either way." Sable took it. She had grown up learning to read the air in a room, to move quietly, to make herself useful or invisible depending on which one kept the peace. Her mother had 3 rules: don't make noise, don't make a mess, and don't expect anything. Sable had followed all 3 for 22 years and had ended up with nothing to show for it except a quiet kind of competence and a very old set of leatherworking tools in a canvas roll that had belonged to Adeline Fournier, sent along with the deed in a box with no note. She did not know, when she pulled into Harrow's Crossing on that gray October afternoon, that the tools were the real inheritance. The town was the kind of place that had been bypassed by most of the 20th century and was holding its breath to see what the 21st would bring. One main street, a gas station, a hardware store, a diner called the Lakeview that faced a parking lot instead of the lake, and a row of commercial buildings in various states of optimism and neglect. The tallest structure was the steeple of St. Andrews, which could be seen from the highway and which gave the impression, from a distance, of a town larger than it was. Sable stopped at the gas station to ask for directions. The man behind the counter, who had the particular look of someone who has survived many winters by not wasting energy on unnecessary movement, told her to take the logging road behind the arena, follow it for 8 kilometers, and look for the mailbox with the blue jay painted on it. Adeline's place, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. He looked at her for a moment. You her family, great niece? He nodded slowly, the way people do when they are filing information away rather than responding to it. Roads are passable, barely. You'll want to get your firewood sorted before the freeze. She thanked him and left. Outside, the sky was the color of old pewter, and she could smell snow in it, though none had fallen yet. She sat in the truck for a moment, her hands on the wheel, looking at the main street of a town she didn't know, in a part of the country she had never visited, about to drive to a cabin left to her by a woman who had been a stranger. She had $43. She had the tools. She had the deed. She started the truck and drove. The cabin was smaller than she had imagined, and more solid than she had hoped. It sat in a clearing at the edge of the lake, surrounded by birch and black spruce, and it had the particular self-sufficiency of a building that had been built to last, rather than to impress. There was a wood stove, a hand pump at the kitchen sink, a sleeping loft, and a workbench along the north wall that took up nearly half the main room. The workbench stopped her cold. It was extraordinary, massive and well-made, built from the same tamarack as the cabin walls, and along its entire surface there were tools, carving knives and gouges in graduated sizes, mallets, clamps, small planes, jars of dye and finishing oil lined up in precise order on a shelf above, and hung on pegs along the wall, pieces of work in various stages of completion. A harness collar, half-stitched, a pair of saddlebags, cut and waiting. The ghost of a person who had been here just weeks before stopped mid-sentence. Sable set down her satchel and walked to the bench. She picked up a small gouge, turned it in her hands. The handle was smooth from use, polished by years of a particular palm. She set it down carefully. The canvas roll of tools she had brought with her, the ones mailed from the lawyer's office, were Adeline's good tools. The ones she took on jobs. The everyday ones were still here, waiting. Sable sat down on the stool in front of the bench and put her face in her hands and let herself cry for the first time since the letter had come, for a woman she had barely known and had never been allowed to know, who had left her everything anyway. She spent the first 2 weeks learning the shape of the place. She was not a leather worker, not really, not yet. She had been taught the basics once, briefly, by a neighbor in her childhood who had since moved away. And she had kept the interest alive in small ways, mending things, restoring things, the quiet satisfaction of taking something broken and making it hold again. But Adeline's workbench was another order entirely. The tools here, the complexity of the half-finished projects, spoke of a skill built over decades. She found Adeline's notebooks in a tin box under the workbench. 4 of them filled in a small angular hand with notes and sketches and measurements and observations. Not a journal, a record of work. Sable read them at night by the lamp, learning the language of the craft the way you learn a place by walking it slowly, until the landmarks start to feel familiar. The town watched her arrive and watched her settle in the careful sideways way of small towns. People noticed without appearing to notice. They formed their opinions privately and offered them in fragments. The woman who ran the hardware store, a steady-voiced person named Pat Delorme, asked after the cabin's roof when Sable came in for weather stripping. The man at the diner asked if she was planning to stay the winter or just sorting the place out to sell. She said she was staying. She saw the slight adjustment in his expression, the recalibration. He refilled her coffee without being asked. There was one person, however, who did not wait for her to come to him. Bertrand Hetu was a saddle maker who had worked out of a shop on the edge of town for 30 years. A broad, deliberate man in his 60s who smelled of neatsfoot oil and pine tar, and whose hands were permanently stained with dye. He appeared at the cabin one afternoon 3 weeks after Sable arrived, driving a rust-spotted half-ton with a sheepdog in the passenger seat. He knocked twice, waited. When she opened the door, he handed her a paper bag from the bakery in town. "You're Adeline's girl," he said. It was not unfriendly, just direct. "Her great-niece," Sable said. He nodded. "Close enough, she talked about you." He looked past her at the workbench. "Mind if I come in?" He walked to the bench and stood before it for a long time without speaking, his hands at his sides. She watched him take it in, the tools, the unfinished work, the jars of dye. His jaw moved slightly, the way a person's jaw moves when they are keeping something inside. "She was the best worker in this part of the country," he said finally. "I'm the second best, and I know it." He turned around. "She teach you?" "I have her notebooks." He looked at her with those clear, assessing eyes and saw something that made him decide. "Come to the shop on Monday," he said. "I'll show you what the notebooks won't." Sable came on Monday. She came the Monday after that, and the one after that. She brought the notebooks. And Bertrand Hetu worked alongside her and talked about the things that didn't get written down. The feel of leather at different cures. How to tell by touch alone when the tension in a stitch was right. The small adjustments of angle and pressure that meant the difference between work that held and work that failed. He taught the way Adeline's notebooks read, precisely without waste, with the assumption that the student was worth the effort. He gave her Adeline's name with every lesson. "Your great-aunt would splice this joint here," he would say, or, "Adeline hated this kind of buckle, and she was right." She learned. She started finishing the pieces Adeline had left on the bench, and Bertrand sold them through his shop without taking a margin, just passing along what the buyers paid. It was not much, but it was enough for flour and fuel, and to put a small amount aside each week, like setting stones in a wall. She was finding the shape of a life here, at the edge of the lake in the bitter start of winter, in the light of an oil lamp over a dead woman's workbench. Then November arrived, and the ice came with it, and everything changed. The first hard freeze came on a Tuesday night, the kind of cold that settles in without fanfare and simply takes possession. Sable woke to a world that had locked itself overnight. The lake was a white plain in the early light. The birch trees rang like glass in the wind. She bundled herself into every layer she owned and went to bring in the last of the wood from the pile under the tarp. The wood pile was at the side of the cabin, backed up against a stone foundation wall that Adeline had built herself, Bertrand had told her, out of fieldstone collected from the shoreline over 3 summers. Sable was stacking the last armful when her boot broke through the frost crust at the base of the foundation wall and dropped 6 inches into a hollow. She set down the wood, she knelt, pulled her boot free, and looked at the hole. It was not simply a frost heave. The ground beneath had collapsed into something, an air pocket, a void. She went inside for the small trenching spade she had found in the shed. It took her 2 hours to clear the area, working in the cold until her fingers went past aching into a strange, distant numbness. The foundation wall had a section at its base that was not fieldstone. It was a square of flat-cut granite, sealed with a mortar that was clearly older and harder than the fieldstone around it. It sat low, near the ground level, perhaps 2 feet by 2 feet, and it was deliberate. She did not go back inside. She kept digging. The granite slab came free with a low grating sound that seemed very loud in the silence of the frozen clearing. Behind it was a small cavity in the earth, lined with cedar planks. The wood had held because the air in there was dry, sealed in by the granite and the mortar. Inside the cavity were 2 things. The first was a tin cash box, the old-fashioned kind with a simple clasp. The second was a leather portfolio, laced shut, the leather dark with age but intact. She sat back on her heels in the frozen dirt and held them in her numb hands and felt the cold air coming up out of the cavity around her wrists like a held breath finally released. She didn't open them outside. She carried them in, set them on the workbench, and stood for a long time looking at them before she took off her coat. Was it just an old cash box? Letters that had lost their meaning with time? Or did a 60-year-old secret still wait inside that leather portfolio? Something that would explain why a woman had sealed it into the foundation of her own home and never spoken of it. We will tell you this much. What Sable found inside that portfolio had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with a name. And that name was going to matter to almost every person in Harrow's Crossing. Tell us in the comments what you think she found. And if you haven't subscribed to Cabin Stories yet, now is a good time, because we are just getting started. The cash box held $412 in old bills and a handwritten note in Adeline's angular script. For the girl, when she comes, don't let them tell her it isn't hers. The portfolio held a surveyor's record. Sable had to read it 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. It was a legal survey dated 1961 of the Lakeshore property known as Lot 14, Concession 7, Harrow Township, the lot that contained the cabin, and it described a boundary that was substantially different from the boundary on Sable's deed. Her deed showed the property ending at the shoreline. The 1961 survey showed it extending 60 meters into the lake, covering a section of the lake bed that contained a freshwater spring of exceptional purity. And the notation, in a different hand, at the bottom of the final page, deeded in error to Harrow Township, 1963. Transfer arranged by G. Rourke, Reeve. Original certificate suppressed. G. Rourke, Gideon Rourke. Sable knew that name. It was on the plaque outside the town hall. It was on the community center. It was on the bronze commemorative stone beside the cenotaph. Gideon Rourke, founder of the Harrow Township Water Authority, 1963. The man who had built the water treatment facility that the whole region still relied on. The water treatment facility that sat, Sable now realized, on a freshwater spring that had been 60 years ago on Adeline Fournier's land. She sat with this knowledge a long time. Outside, the lake was silent and white. Inside, the workbench held its tools in patient rows. The notebooks were stacked where she had left them. The mortar dust from the foundation wall was still on her hands. She thought of her mother's voice. Don't make noise. Don't make a mess. Don't expect anything. She thought of Adeline, who had sealed this record into the foundation of her home 60 years ago, and left it there, and left the tools, and left the cabin, and left the note. Don't let them tell her it isn't hers. Adeline had known. She had waited, and she had not had enough time, and so she had passed the waiting on. Sable pulled Adeline's good tools from the canvas roll and set them on the bench beside the portfolio. The awl, the bone folder, the small curved needle her great-aunt had used to close her finest seams. She lined them up and looked at them. She needed to understand what she had before she knew what to do with it, and she needed someone she could trust. She went to Bertrand Haytu. She found him at his bench, working a piece of harness leather with a beveling tool. He looked up when she came in and read something in her face that made him set the tool down. She laid the portfolio and its contents on his workbench without speaking. He read the survey slowly, his big stained hands very still, holding the edges of the paper. He read the notation at the bottom twice. She watched his expression not change, the careful blankness of a man who has learned to absorb things quietly. Where was this? He asked. She told him about the foundation, the granite slab, the cedar-lined cavity. He was quiet for a long moment. The sheepdog, lying under the bench, lifted her head and then put it back down. Gideon Rourke has been dead for 12 years, Bertrand said. I know. But his son, Merritt Rourke, is the chair of the Harrow Municipal Council, and his daughter-in-law sits on the Water Authority Board. Sable had not known that. She absorbed it. And this spring, Bertrand said carefully, is the source the water treatment plant draws from. The whole system depends on it. Which means, Sable said slowly, following it out, the water authority has been operating on land it doesn't legally own. He nodded. He looked at the survey again, then at her. Adeline tried to do something about this, he said quietly. Years ago, before you were born. She told me once, late one night in October, that she'd taken papers to the township office and been turned away at the door. Told the deed was clear, and if she pushed it, she'd lose the cabin too. She never said more than that. I didn't press. He paused. I should have pressed. Sable thought about an old woman, alone at a lake in October, being turned away at the door of the township office with papers in her hand. She thought about a granite slab mortared into a foundation. A note. Don't let them tell her it isn't hers. I'm not turning away, Sable said. Bertram looked at her then in a way that she would remember later, a look that was the quiet opposite of dismissal. No, he agreed. I didn't think you were. He knew a woman in Sudbury, a land rights lawyer named Catherine Sue, who had handled rural property disputes for 20 years. She came the following week and sat at Sable's kitchen table with a portfolio and a pot of tea and said very little for a long time. This is legitimate, she said at last. The survey is registered. The suppression notation is handwritten, which is unusual, but the document itself predates any subsequent transfer, and that's what matters. She looked at Sable over the rim of her cup. It's a quiet claim. Nothing explosive, but it's real, and it will hold. What does that mean, practically? Sable asked. It means the water authority has been using this spring without legal right for 60 years. It means you have a claim to compensation potentially significant and to a formal correction of the property boundary. Catherine Sue set down her cup. It also means Merritt Rourke is not going to be happy. He was not. Word moved through Harrow's crossing the way. Word moves through small towns, not all at once but in layers, first as rumor, then as fact, then as the kind of established community knowledge that gets discussed at the hardware store and the diner and in the parking lots of the arena and the church. Sable heard the edges of it everywhere she went. She heard the version that said she was a newcomer stirring up trouble. She heard the version that said she was chasing money that wasn't hers. She heard the version that said Adeline had been difficult, always difficult, a woman who wanted things her way and couldn't get along. She went to the hardware store for sandpaper, and Pat Delorme handed it over without comment, then added, I heard Adeline tell that story once. Her version. A pause. It was a lot like yours. She went to the diner, and the man there said nothing, but refilled her coffee twice without being asked. Merritt Rourke came to the cabin on a Thursday afternoon. He was a big man in his 50s, the specific kind of large that comes from having moved through the world without much resistance. His voice was easy, and his smile was calibrated. He stood in her doorway and looked at the workbench and the tools and back at her with the expression of a man who was accustomed to people finding him reasonable. I understand you've been looking into some old property records, he said pleasantly. I have, Sable said. These things can get complicated. Old surveys, old notations, sometimes they reflect disputes that were resolved in ways that just weren't well documented. Nobody was wrong necessarily. Things were different then. He let that settle. I'd like to think we could work something out without getting into a whole legal process. The water authority does a lot of good for this community. I'd hate to see that disrupted over a paperwork issue from 60 years ago. Sable said, my great-aunt came to the township office with that paperwork 60 years ago and was sent away. Merritt Rourke's easy smile did not change, but something behind it adjusted. I wouldn't know about that, he said. I can only speak to what we can do going forward. I know, said Sable. Catherine Sue will be in touch. He left without saying goodbye. She watched from the window as he backed his truck down the lane, and she felt the cabin solid behind her, the wood stove ticking with heat, the workbench holding its tools in the quiet north light. She was not afraid of him. She was surprised to discover that. She had spent 22 years making herself small enough to keep the peace. And now she was standing in a cabin at the edge of a frozen lake telling a man with his grandfather's name on the town cenotaph that she would not be moved, and the fear she had expected was not there. What was there instead was something simpler and more solid. A sense of having been given a task and being equal to it. She went back to the workbench and picked up the piece of work she had been finishing before he came. It was a small saddlebag, started by Adeline, completed by Sable. The stitching at the flap was hers. She ran her thumb along it, checking the tension. It held. The legal process took 4 months. We will not pretend it was easy or clean. There were meetings Sable drove into Sudbury for, in weather that had no business permitting travel. There were documents requested, and documents produced. There were 2 occasions when Merritt Rourke's lawyer suggested that the survey was irregular, that its provenance was uncertain, that a reasonable settlement might be more sensible than a protracted dispute, and both times Catherine Sue responded in the measured, unhurried way of a person who has the ground firmly under her feet. Bertrand Hetu appeared at the municipal council meeting in January, when the matter came before the board for an initial hearing. He sat in the second row in his good coat, and he did not speak unless spoken to, but he was there, his hands folded, his presence a simple declaration that this young woman was not alone and was known to people who had roots in this place. Pat Delorme told 3 people at the hardware counter, in the same steady voice she used for everything, that she had heard Adeline Fournier try to raise this exact matter in 1964 and be dismissed by Gideon Rourke in a public meeting, with a comment that Pat had never forgotten and chose not to repeat. The 3 people told other people. The man at the diner put a jar on the counter for Sable's legal fund. He didn't ask permission. It was 3/4 full by the end of the week. Merritt Rourke, when he finally appeared before the administrative tribunal to which the claim had been referred, was not blustering or red-faced. He was careful and contained, and his lawyer was expensive. But the survey was registered, the notation was real, and Adeline Fournier's name was on the original deed, and 60 years had not changed those facts. The tribunal ruled in Sable's favor on the boundary question. The water authority's use of the spring source would require formalization through a utility easement negotiated with Sable as landowner, at fair market value retroactive to the date Catherine Sue had determined was legally supportable. It was not a punishment. The crime was 60 years old and the man who had committed it was dead, but it was a correction, clear and formal, entered into the record. A name that had been carved into bronze and stone in Harrow's crossing was now also present in a different kind of document. A legal finding, quiet and permanent and specific about what Gideon Rourke, Reeve, had done in 1963 to a woman alone at a lake. Merritt Rourke did not leave town. He was not broken or ruined, but the ease went out of him, and the particular authority that had moved through rooms ahead of him like weather seemed to have changed in quality. People still spoke to him. Fewer of them changed their expressions when he walked in. The easement negotiation with Catherine Sue's guidance resulted in a settlement that Sable would not discuss in specific terms, but which was substantial enough to allow her to make 2 decisions. The first was to repair the cabin properly. New roof, repointed foundation, a second window in the main room to let the morning light reach the workbench. She hired a crew from town for the structural work and did the finishing herself the same way she finished leather, slowly by hand, with attention to what the materials needed. The second was to buy the abandoned building 2 doors down from Bertrand Hetu's shop on the main street of Harrow's Crossing, the former cobbler's, with its good north light and its long front window. She spent the winter fitting it out. A workbench of her own along the north wall. Adeline's tools hung on their pegs. The notebooks, framed and mounted beside the window, not to look at but to remember. She opened in March, when the ice on the lake was still hard, but the air had that particular quality of the very first loosening, the cold still there but something different moving in it. She made a sign for the door, carved into a piece of white cedar, Voss Leatherworks. She carved it herself, with Adeline's good gouges, the ones from the canvas roll. Bertrand Hetu stood outside on the morning she hung it and looked at it for a long time with his hands in his coat pockets. Adeline would have said it was about time, he said. Did she want me to come here? Sable asked. She had been carrying the question for months. Did she know I would? He was quiet for a moment. The street was empty, the light still low, the cold still in everything. She knew she was leaving this for someone, he said. She said she hoped it would be someone young, with good hands and a reason to stay. He looked at the sign. I think she would have been happy with you. Sable looked up at the sign, at her own name in the wood, and felt the same thing she had felt standing in the doorway of the cabin, while Merritt Rourke backed down the lane. That she was standing on ground that held. That she was not small. That she had been handed something by the dead and had carried it the way it deserved to be carried, to the right place, in the right time. She went inside and opened the front window and let the March air come in. The tools were on the bench. The light was on the bench. She picked up the small awl from the canvas roll, the one she had carried from the south in a cracked satchel with $43, and turned it in her hands the way she had turned it on the first evening in the cabin, and felt the same thing she always felt now. The particular worn smoothness of a handle shaped by someone else's hand that had, over these months, begun to fit her own. She set it down and got to work. We think about Sable sometimes when we are putting together these stories. About the way she came north with almost nothing and found, under frozen ground and inside old leather, a truth that had been waiting 60 years for the right person to carry it. We think about Adeline Fournier, who sealed her evidence into a foundation wall and trusted that someone would come. Some things are only preserved because someone decided they were worth keeping, and some inheritances have nothing to do with money. If you have ever found something left behind by someone who believed in you before you believed in yourself, tell us about it in the comments. We would really like to hear your story. And if Pearl's story moved something in you, so will the next one. Subscribe to Cabin Stories and stay close. There is always more waiting to be told.